They were erased from history. A civilization so advanced, so powerful, their descendants could only describe them as gods. They arrived in Ireland on flying ships, hidden in dark clouds. They wielded weapons of light and possessed technology that could heal any wound and provide endless sustenance. They were masters of magic, poetry, and art. And then they vanished. Christian monks, rewriting history, demoted them from gods to simple fairies, trivializing their memory and burying their story under centuries of folklore. But what if the original legends were true? What if, in the misty past of Northern Europe, a tribe of super beings truly walked the earth? This isn't just a myth. It's a memory of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. And the question that haunts us to this day is not if they existed but what or who they really were. The oldest Irish chronicles tell us they didn't originate on Earth, or at least not in our world. They came from 4 mythical northern cities, Felius, Gorias, Murias, and Phineas, where they mastered the highest forms of knowledge and magic. When they finally came for Ireland, they didn't sail in on wooden ships. The annals say they descended from the sky, landing on the iron mountains of Connaught, and a great darkness covered the sun for 3 days and 3 nights. They burned their own ships upon arrival, a terrifying statement of intent. There was no retreat. This was their new home, and they would take it by any means necessary. With them they brought 4 legendary treasures. For artifacts of such immense power, they sound less like relics of the Bronze Age, and more like something from science fiction. From the city of Felius, they brought the Lugh Fail, the Stone of Destiny. It was said this stone would cry out with a human voice when the true High King of Ireland stood upon it. A perfect lie detector, a kingmaker powered by an unknown force. From Gorias, they carried the Spear of Lugh, a thirsty living weapon that never missed its mark and guaranteed victory to whoever wielded it. From Phineas came the Sword of Nuada, a blade of pure light from which no one could escape once it was drawn from its scabbard. And finally, from Murias, they brought the cauldron of the Dagda, a vessel of plenty from which no company would ever leave hungry, an endless source of food, a weapon that never misses, a sword of light, and a stone that could read a man's soul. These were not the tools of primitive tribesmen. These were the instruments of gods. But Ireland was not empty. It was already inhabited by a people known as the Firbolg, a sturdy human race who had claimed the island for themselves. They saw the dark clouds descend. They saw the shining, handsome strangers emerge from the mists, and they knew their world was about to end. The Tuatha Dé Danann, led by their noble king Nuada, offered the Firbolg a choice: surrender half the island and live in peace, or face them in total war. The Firbolg, proud and defiant, chose war. The 2 armies met at the pass of Balgatin, preparing for what would be known as the First Battle of Mag Twyard. For 4 days the battle raged. The Firbolg were fierce warriors, fighting with desperate courage for their homes. But they were outmatched. The Tuatha Dé Danann moved with a grace and strategy that seemed supernatural. Their shining armor and superior weapons cut through the Firbolg ranks. It was a clash between the past and the future, between humanity and something other. By the end of the 4th day, the Firbolg army was shattered. Their king lay dead, and their dominion over Ireland was broken. The Tuatha Dé Danann were victorious. But victory came at a terrible cost. In the final decisive duel, the king of the Tuatha Dé Nuada fought the Firbolg champion Sreng. In a brutal exchange, Sreng's greatsword swung down and severed King Nuada's right arm at the shoulder. The Tuatha Dé won the battle, but they had lost their king. Because their laws, their ancient and sacred tradition, were absolute. No man with a physical blemish, no one who was incomplete, could rule over them. A king had to be a perfect vessel for the sovereignty of the land. Nuada, the victorious, the noble, the leader who had brought them to their promised land, was now disqualified from his own throne. The Tuatha Dé Danann, now rulers of a new land but without a leader, faced a crisis. They needed a king. Their search led them to a curious choice: a young handsome warrior named Bress. Bress was renowned for his stunning beauty, but he held a dark secret in his blood. His mother was of the Tuatha Dé, but his father was a king of the Fomorians, a shadowy, monstrous race of giants who ruled from beneath the sea and would one day become their greatest enemies. The Tuatha Dé, in a gesture of diplomacy, hoped that by making Bress king, they could build an alliance with the powerful Fomorians. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Bress the Beautiful, as he was known, became Bress the Tyrant. His Fomorian blood ran cold with greed, not nobility. Where the Tuatha Dé valued generosity, artistry, and honor above all else, Bress valued only gold and power. He imposed crushing taxes on his own people, demanding tribute for the Fomorian Empire. For the first time, the divine Tuatha Dé Danann felt the sting of oppression. Their greatest champions were put to work as common laborers. Ogma, the god of language and literature, was forced to haul firewood. The Dagda, the great and benevolent father god whose cauldron could feed armies, was reduced to digging trenches and building forts. The new king's halls were dark and cold, with no poets to sing, no musicians to play, and no generosity to be found. The vibrant, magical society of the Tuatha Dé Danann began to wither under his oppressive rule. The humiliation festered. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. The breaking point came over an act of supreme disrespect. A wandering poet named Kerper came to the king's court seeking hospitality, a sacred duty for any Irish king. Instead of a feast, Bress gave him 3 small, dry cakes on a tiny plate. It was a profound insult. Enraged, Kerper composed a magical satire, the first of its kind in Ireland, a poem so sharp and so potent it was said to be a curse. He publicly shamed Bress for his stinginess and his wretched rule. The poem spread like wildfire, and for the first time, the people had a voice for their discontent. The magic of the word proved more powerful than the tyranny of a king. Meanwhile, a miracle was taking place in the shadows. Diensect, the master physician of the Tuatha Dé, a god of healing whose skill was unmatched, had not forgotten his fallen king. Aided by the master craftsman Creighton, he forged a new arm for Nuada. But this was no simple prosthetic. It was a fully articulated arm of shining silver, which moved and flexed and felt as if it were made of flesh and blood. An impossible work of art and biomechanics. With this new magical limb, Nuada was whole again. He was perfect. He was once again fit to be king. The elders of the Tuatha Dé Danann confronted Bress, armed with the poet's satire and the sight of their restored king, Nuada of the Silver Arm. They laid out his crimes, his greed, his oppression, his failure to uphold the sacred laws of hospitality and generosity. His reign was over. Defeated and humiliated, Bress was deposed and exiled from Ireland. He fled back to his father's kingdom, deep beneath the waves, his heart burning with a desire for revenge. The Tuatha Dé Danann had reclaimed their throne. The rightful king was restored, and a golden age seemed ready to begin. But in overthrowing the half-Fomorian tyrant, they had thrown a stone into the dark waters of the underworld. And now the ripples were coming back as a tidal wave. Bress, scorned and vengeful, was gathering the greatest army of monsters the world had ever seen. He was coming back to claim Ireland, not with taxes and treaties but with fire and death. The first battle of Mag Tuired was a war against men. What was coming next was a war against nightmares. The cost of that first victory was steeper than anyone could have imagined. In the final, bloody moments of the battle, the fur-bald king Eachcade had faced the leader of the Tuatha Dé Danann, King Nuada, in single combat. And with a desperate, sweeping blow, he had severed Nuada's right arm at the shoulder. The Tuatha Dé had won the day, but their king was now maimed, broken. And in their ancient culture, this was a catastrophe. Their most sacred law, the very foundation of their kingship, was absolute. A king had to be physically perfect, whole. Any blemish, any scar, any missing limb, and he was deemed unfit to rule. It was a symbol. If the king's body was broken, the kingdom itself would break. And so, with a heavy heart, Nuada, the victorious king who had led them from the smoky skies to conquer a new homeland, was forced to step down from his throne. This left the Tuatha Dé Danann in a perilous position. They were a conquering army in a new land, their leadership in tatters, and across the Grey Sea the Fomorians were watching. These were not the Furbolg, men of clay and earth. The Fomorians were something else entirely. Ancient, chaotic beings who had ruled the island in the darkness before men. They were giants and sorcerers, beings with the heads of goats and others with a single massive eye in the center of their forehead. For generations, they had demanded a brutal tribute from the previous inhabitants of Ireland, and now they saw the Tuatha Dé Danann, weakened and leaderless, as their new source of wealth. But instead of open war, they offered a treaty, a political marriage. They proposed a new king to rule over the Tuatha Dé, one who could unite both peoples. His name was Bress. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect solution. Bress was the son of a Fomorian king. but his mother was one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was said to be the most beautiful man in all of Ireland, the very picture of perfection. He had the blood of both tribes. He could be the bridge, the peacemaker. Weary of war and desperate for stability, the Tuatha Dé Danann agreed. They crowned Bress the new High King of Ireland, and in doing so they sealed their own doom. Because while Bress had the beauty of his mother's people, he had the cold, greedy heart of his father's. His reign began not with celebration, but with calculation. He saw Ireland not as a home to nurture, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. He imposed crushing taxes on his own people, the Tuatha Dé Danann. He demanded their finest grain, their fattest cattle, their richest milk, all to be sent to the Fomorian strongholds. Under Bress, the famed generosity and joy of the Tuatha Dé vanished. The fires in their hearts grew cold. The music and poetry that once filled their halls fell silent. Laughter died on their lips, replaced by the grumble of empty stomachs and the weight of oppression. Bress was systematically starving his people to enrich his Fomorian allies. He didn't just tax them, he humiliated their greatest champions. He ordered the Dagda, the good god, the Lord of Abundance, a figure of immense power and mirth, to work as a common mason, building forts and ramparts for the Fomorians. The Dagda, whose magical cauldron could feed an army and never run empty, was given meager rations, barely enough to sustain his massive frame. It was a calculated insult, a way to break the spirit of the most beloved of their gods. He took on Ogma, the champion of warriors and the inventor of the Ogham alphabet, a god whose strength was matched only by his eloquence. Bress stripped him of his sword and forced him to perform the demeaning task of hauling firewood for the royal halls, a chore for the lowest of servants. Every day, Ogma had to gather a bundle of wood, enough for all the fires, a constant, grating reminder of his subjugation. This was the nature of Bress's tyranny. It was not just cruel, it was petty. It was a slow, grinding erosion of everything the Tuatha Dé Danann stood for: honor, creativity, strength, and joy. He was a parasite, draining the life from his hosts, and for 7 long years they endured it. They had chosen peace, and this was its bitter price. But the Fomorians were never satisfied. Their demands grew. Their presence in Ireland became an occupation, and looming over them all was the shadow of the Fomorian king himself, Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor was a nightmare made flesh, a cyclopean giant whose fortress stood on Tory Island, a windswept rock off the northern coast. As a boy, he had spied on his father's druids as they brewed a potion of death. The fumes from the cauldron had wafted into his face, transforming one of his eyes into a weapon of mass destruction. It was so potent, so deadly, that he had to keep it constantly shut, covered by 7 heavy eyelids. It was said that when those lids were lifted, one by one, whatever his gaze fell upon would burst into flame and die. An entire army could be withered to dust in an instant. This was the power backing Bress's rule. This was the threat that kept the Tuatha Dé Danann in chains. Balor was the ultimate deterrent, the apocalypse held in reserve. But there was a prophecy that haunted Balor, a dark whisper that followed him through his stone fortress. A druid had foretold that he would one day be killed by his own grandson. Terrified, Balor took his only daughter, a beautiful goddess named Ithen, and locked her away in the highest tower on Tory Island, surrounded by guards, to ensure she would never meet a man. He would defy fate itself. Back on the mainland, the breaking point for the Tuatha Dé Danann finally came, not from a warrior but from a poet. A wandering satirist named Cairper came to the court of King Bress seeking the customary hospitality afforded to a man of his station. But instead of a feast and a place of honor, Bress sent him to a tiny, dark, unfurnished cell. For his meal, he was given 3 small, dry cakes on a tiny plate, with no ale to wash them down. For the Tuatha Dé Danann, this was the ultimate sin. Hospitality was sacred. To insult a poet was to insult the very soul of the people. That night, simmering with rage in his cold cell, Cairper composed the first satire ever uttered in Ireland. It was a short, blistering verse, a curse that laid bare all of Bress's greed and stinginess. He proclaimed, "Without food quickly on a dish, without a cow's milk on which a calf grows, without a dwelling for a man under the gloom of night, without paying a company of storytellers, let that be the condition of Bress." In our modern world, this sounds like just a clever insult. But to the ancient Irish, the words of a poet had real, tangible power. A satire was a magical weapon, and when Kerper recited his verse the next morning, the curse took hold. Bress's perfect face began to blister and rot. His beauty, the very basis of his claim to the throne, curdled into ugliness. The land itself seemed to react. The crops failed. The rivers ran dry. His power, built on a lie, crumbled to dust. He was no longer perfect. He could no longer be king. The Tuatha Dé Danann rose up and deposed him. They sent him into exile, and he fled, humiliated and enraged, across the sea to the only home he had left, the dark, formidable court of his father. Meanwhile, a miracle had occurred. Diensect, the god of healing, a master physician and craftsman, had forged a new arm for Nuada, an arm made of gleaming, articulated silver. It moved and flexed and gripped just like a real arm. With this prosthetic, Nuada was whole once more. He was perfect, and his people joyfully placed him back on the throne. King Nuada of the Silver Arm reigned again. But their celebration was short-lived, because across the sea, the exiled Bress was telling his story to Balor of the Evil Eye. He spoke of the insult, the rebellion, the riches of Ireland that were rightfully theirs. And Balor, his rage stoked and his greed ignited, began to gather his forces. He called upon every monstrous tribe and foul creature under his command. He assembled an army of giants and sorcerers, a legion of nightmares dredged from the darkest corners of the world. The treaty was broken. The time for taxes and tribute was over. Balor was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to annihilate the Tuatha Dé Danann, to scour them from the island of Ireland, and to claim it for the Fomorians forever. Nuada was back on the throne, but his people were weakened, demoralized, and now faced a threat 1,000 times greater than the Firbolg. As they looked to the horizon, they knew that the tide was coming in, a tide of darkness that threatened to drown them all. They needed more than a king. They needed a savior, and they had no idea that he was already on his way. That savior's name was Nuada, and he did not arrive on a wave but in a shadow. For 3 days, a strange and unnatural darkness had fallen over the coast of Connacht. The sun was blotted out, not by clouds, but by a thick swirling mist that seemed to hum with an unseen energy. The Firbolg, watching from the hills, felt a primal fear creep into their hearts. This was not the mist of the sea, nor the fog of the mountains. This was something else, something deliberate. And then on the 3rd day the mist parted, not gently, but as if a curtain was torn aside. And there, standing on the shore, were the ships. But they were not the crude, hide-covered curraghs of the Firbolg, nor the monstrous, dark-timbered longships of the Fomorians. These were elegant vessels, crafted from strange, pale wood, gleaming as if lit from within. And from them disembarked an army unlike any the world had ever seen. They were tall, taller than any man, with an effortless grace that seemed to defy the very earth they walked on. Their hair shone like spun gold or silver, or the deepest red of a dying sun. Their eyes held the wisdom of ages, and their faces were so perfectly formed they were painful to look upon. A beauty that was both divine and terrifying. They carried shields that shimmered and spears that seemed to thirst for light. These were not men. These were the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They had journeyed from the 4 great cities of the north, Phaleus, Gorias, Murias, and Phineas, where they had mastered the highest arts of magic, poetry, and craftsmanship. And they had brought with them 4 great treasures. From Phaleus came the Stone of Destiny, the Lugh Fail, which would cry out when the true king of Ireland stood upon it. From Gorias came the Spear of Lugh, a weapon so thirsty for blood it had to be kept in a slumber of poppy leaves, lest it wake and slay on its own. From Phineas came the Sword of Nuada, a blade from which no one could escape whence it was drawn. And from Murias they brought the cauldron of the Dagda, from which no company would ever go away hungry. They were a pantheon walking the earth, a force of nature given form. And as the last of their people stepped onto the green shores of Ireland, their king Nuada of the Silver Hand gave a single chilling command: burn the ships. Flames erupted along the shoreline, consuming the magnificent vessels in a furious blaze. The Firbolg watched in stunned silence as the otherworldly fleet was reduced to ash and smoke. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. This was a declaration written in fire. There is no retreat. There is no going back. This land is our destiny, or it is our grave. The king of the Firbolg, Eachad mac Airc, sent his greatest champion to parley with these strange newcomers. His name was Sreng, a warrior of immense size and strength, a man who was the very embodiment of the Firbolg's resilience. He approached the shining army alone, his iron shield on his back and his two massive, heavy spears in hand. In response, the Tuatha Dé Danann sent forth their own champion. His name was Bress. He was handsome, his words smooth, but Sreng saw something calculating in his eyes. They met in the middle of the field, two worlds colliding. Sreng looked at Bress's weapon, a single light razor-sharp spear, and felt a pang of contempt. It looked like a toy compared to his own brute instruments of war. But when he looked at the man holding it, at the calm, confident power radiating from him, that contempt turned to caution. Through Bress, King Nuada of the Tuatha Dé Danann made his offer. It was, on the surface, a generous one. He did not claim Ireland by right of conquest. Instead, he spoke of kinship, of a shared ancestry tracing back to their forefather Nemd. He spoke of the true enemy, the Fomorians, the shadow that still lurked on the sea. "We do not come to displace you," the message said. "We come to join you. Give us half of this island to call our own, and we will pledge our swords, our shields, and our sacred arts to you. Together we will defend this land against the darkness, and it will be a beacon for all ages." Sreng carried the offer back to King Eochaid. The Firbolg chieftains gathered in council, their minds a storm of fear and pride. Half the island? It was an outrageous demand. But what was the alternative? To fight these godlike beings who arrived in a magic mist and carried weapons that shone like stars? Some argued for peace. They were tired of war, tired of being driven from their homes. They had finally found a land where they could live, and the thought of losing it all in a hopeless battle was unbearable. But then Sreng, the great champion, spoke, and his voice was like the grinding of stones. He held up his heavy iron spear, and then described the light, deadly spear of Bress. He told them that the Tuatha Dé Danann were not just more beautiful, not just more skilled in magic, but their very way of war was different. It was faster, sharper, more lethal. But it was not invincible. "They offer us peace and half the island," Sreng boomed, his voice silencing the dissent. "But what kind of peace is it, to live in the shadow of a master? We toiled to clear these plains. We built these forts with our own hands. We have earned this land with our sweat and our sorrow. If we give them half today because we fear their sharp spears, what will stop them from taking the other half tomorrow when they desire it? Will we give it then, too? No. This land is ours. Every hill, every river, every stone. If they want it, they must take it from our dead hands." His words struck a chord deep in the soul of the Firbolg. They were a people defined by struggle, by their refusal to break. They had been slaves in Greece, but they had not broken. They had been driven from their homes, but they had not broken. They would not break now. Pride, fierce and stubborn, won out over fear. King Eochaid sent Sreng back with their answer. A resounding no. There would be no sharing. There would be no treaty. Ireland belonged to the Firbolg, and they would defend it to the last man. The Tuatha Dé Danann received the news with a cold, solemn acceptance. They had offered peace, and it had been refused. Now, only the language of steel remained. But this would not be a chaotic slaughter. These were two proud peoples. They agreed to a truce, a period of several weeks to allow both sides to prepare their weapons and gather their forces. They even agreed on the location for the battle, the Great Plain to the south, known as Mag Twyard, the Plain of Pillars. During this time, the two sides exchanged champions, not to fight but to observe, to see the craft of their enemies. Sreng and his warriors visited the camp of the Tuatha Dé, and they were filled with a terrible awe. They saw smiths who didn't just hammer metal, but seemed to sing it into shape, crafting swords that were impossibly light yet stronger than any iron. They saw physicians who could mend grievous wounds with herbs and whispered words. They saw a people who moved with a purpose and intelligence that was utterly alien. In return, Bress and his companions saw the camp of the Firbolg. They saw no magic, no divine craftsmanship. They saw grim-faced men sharpening heavy, crude iron swords. They saw warriors practicing with massive shields and thick-shafted spears. They saw brute force, raw courage, and an unshakable, desperate resolve. When Bress returned to Nuada, his report was simple. Their weapons are clumsy, their armor is heavy, but their hearts are as hard as the stones of this land. The truce ended. The sun rose on the appointed day. casting long shadows across the plain of pillars. On one side stood the Fir-bolg, a vast sea of hardened muscle and iron, their faces set like stone, a silent promise of a bloody death to any who tried to take their home. Their king Eachcéad mac Éirc stood before them, a tragic figure caught between the pride of his people and the certainty of their doom. On the other side stood the Tuatha Dé Danann. They were not a sea but a glittering line of light. Each warrior was a masterpiece of form and function, their silver armor glowing in the dawn, their enchanted weapons humming with contained power. At their head was King Nuada, his legendary sword held aloft, its edge so fine it seemed to cut the morning light itself. He looked across the field at the doomed, defiant army of the Fir-bolg, and perhaps he felt a sliver of pity, but it was overshadowed by destiny. Two peoples, two kings, one island. The air grew still, the world holding its breath. The future of Ireland would be decided here, on this field, in a torrent of blood and magic. The first battle of Mag Tuired was about to begin. The battlefield of Mag Tuired, the plain of pillars, fell into a terrifying silence. On one side stood the Fir-bolg, 1,000 generations of Ireland in their blood. They were stout, earthy, their faces grimly set. They held heavy shields and broad-bladed spears, their feet planted firmly in the soil they called home. They were the defenders, the incumbents, their power rooted in sheer physical might and the ferocious will to protect what was theirs. Opposite them, the Tuatha Dé Danann were a different sight entirely. They seemed to shimmer in the morning light, their armor intricately worked, their weapons gleaming with an inner fire. They stood not with the brute stance of warriors, but with the poised grace of masters. They were fewer in number, but each one carried an aura of immense power, a quiet confidence that was more unsettling than any war cry. They were not just soldiers, they were poets, smiths, healers, and sorcerers. And their king, Nuada of the Silver Hand, stood at their forefront, his presence a beacon of light and destiny. The first move was not a charge, but a challenge. From the Fir-bolg lines, their greatest champion, a warrior named Sreng, stepped forward. He was a mountain of a man, his arms thick as tree trunks, his gaze hard as granite. He called out, his voice a gravelly roar that rolled across the plain, demanding to face the champion of the invaders. From the Danann, it was not Nuada who answered, but one of his own champions, Bress. The two met in the space between the armies, a formal duel to test the mettle of each people. But the fight was a study in contrasts. Sreng fought with raw, overwhelming force, his heavy axe swinging in deadly arcs. Bress, however, was a blur of motion, his lighter, sharper sword deflecting and parrying with impossible speed. The Fir-bolg fought with strength, the Tuatha Dé Danann fought with skill. They were faster, their tactics more advanced, their very movements a form of art. The duel ended in a stalemate, but the message was clear. The old ways of Ireland were about to collide with something new, something impossibly refined and potent. And then the horns blew. The earth itself seemed to groan as the Fir-bolg army surged forward, a tidal wave of muscle and iron, their shouts tearing the sky apart. It was a terrifying primal display of force, meant to shatter the nerve of any opponent. But the Tuatha Dé Danann did not flinch. They held their line, and as the Fir-bolg charged, something strange began to happen. The air itself seemed to thicken. The Danann druids, standing behind the lines of warriors, raised their hands and began to chant in a language that was ancient when the world was young. A thick, impenetrable mist rolled from their lines, a magical fog that blinded the charging Fir-bolg, sowing confusion and terror in their ranks. Men tripped over unseen obstacles, crashed into their own comrades, their charge losing all cohesion. From within that mist, the Danann warriors struck. They moved like ghosts, their shining spears finding their marks with lethal precision. They didn't fight in a chaotic melee. They fought in disciplined formations, a symphony of deadly grace. Their physicians and healers moved just behind the lines, using spells and unknown herbs to instantly mend wounds that should have been fatal, allowing injured warriors to return to the fight almost immediately. The Fir-bolg were fighting an army. The Tuatha Dé Danann were a living, thinking weapon. For 4 days the battle raged. The Fir-bolg fought with the desperate courage of a people defending their world, but they were being systematically dismantled. Their greatest warriors were cut down by Danann heroes who seemed to move faster than thought. Their sheer numbers were negated by superior strategy and the terrifying power of the Danann druids, who called down showers of fire and conjured phantom armies to harass their flanks. Finally, the fur-bald king, Eochaid mac Airc, saw that his army was on the verge of breaking. In a desperate final gambit, he rallied his personal guard and charged directly for the center of the Danann line, seeking to cut down their king Tuatha. He knew that if the head of the serpent was severed, the body might yet die. Seeing the charge, Tuatha met it head-on. The two kings, the old and the new, finally came face to face in the bloody chaos. Their duel was the battle in miniature. Eochaid was a whirlwind of fury, his heavy sword crashing against Tuatha's shield like a smith's hammer. He was all strength, all heart, all desperation. Tuatha, by contrast, was a master. Every movement was precise, economical, and deadly. He flowed around Eochaid's attacks, his own bright sword a flicker of silver light, seeking the one opening, the one fatal mistake. The clash of their blades was the sound of an age ending and another beginning. But in the heart of the duel, the fur-bog champion, Sreng, saw his king in peril. With a blood-curdling roar, he broke through the Danann guard and charged at Tuatha's side. Tuatha, focused on Eochaid, turned to parry Sreng's attack, but the sheer force of the champion's blow was immense. Sreng's massive axe did not cut through Tuatha's shield. It shattered it. It cleaved through the shield, through the armor beneath, and through the arm that held it. In a spray of crimson, Tuatha's right arm and hand were severed at the shoulder, falling to the blood-soaked earth. A collective gasp went through the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their king, their perfect, shining king, was maimed. The shock of it was a physical blow, a silence that cut through the roar of battle. For the Tuatha Dé Danann, this was more than just an injury. It was a violation of a sacred fundamental law. A king had to be whole. A king had to be physically perfect, a blemish-free vessel for the sovereignty of the land itself. An imperfect king meant an imperfect and barren kingdom. In that moment of shock, Tuatha staggered back. But his will was iron. Even as his lifeblood poured onto the ground, he did not fall. His personal guard, enraged, swarmed Sreng and Eochaid. The battle reached a new level of frenzy. The Tuatha Dé Danann, seeing their king fall, were filled with a cold, terrifying fury. They no longer fought with just skill and magic. They fought with vengeance. The fur-bog line, already weakened, finally broke and scattered. The battle was won. King Eochaid was pursued and slain, his dream of a fur-bog Ireland dying with him. The Tuatha Dé Danann were the undisputed masters of the island, but the cost was staggering. The plain of pillars was littered with the dead of both sides, and as the mist of battle and magic finally cleared, the victors looked upon their king. Tuatha stood, pale and bleeding, his right side a ruin. He had led them to their promised land. He had conquered their new home. He had won the war for Ireland, but in the very same swing of the axe that had secured their victory, he had lost his crown. The law was absolute. The Tuatha Dé Danann had a new home, but they were now without a king. Tuatha, the hero, the conqueror, the visionary who had led them from the northern cities, across the sea, and to this final triumph, was no longer fit to rule. A shadow had fallen over their glorious victory. A crisis was brewing, one that came not from an external enemy, but from the very heart of their own sacred traditions. Who could possibly lead them now? Who could sit on the throne of a maimed king? The Tuatha Dé Danann had won Ireland, but they were about to discover that the greatest battles were not fought with swords and spears, but with law, ambition, and the cruel twists of fate. The law was absolute. A king of the Tuatha Dé Danann had to be perfect, physically whole, a flawless vessel for the sovereignty of the land itself. A blemish on the king was a blemish on the kingdom. And Tuatha, their victorious leader, their hero who had led them to this new home, was now missing an arm. He was maimed. He was disqualified. It was a brutal, unthinking piece of sacred legislation, but it was the law. And it threw the victorious gods into a state of absolute crisis. They had just conquered a country, but now they were leaderless, adrift in their own triumph. The Fomorians, though defeated, were still out there, lurking on the edges of the world, nursing their wounds and their hatred. The Tuatha Dé needed a king, and they needed one now. But who? Who could possibly fill the void left by Tuatha? The answer came in the form of a political compromise. A deal so perfect on paper it seemed like destiny itself had written it. There was a young man among them named Bress. And Bress was, by all accounts, perfect. He was said to be so impossibly handsome that the sun and moon would stop in their tracks just to gaze upon him. He was charismatic, well-spoken, and he had a unique heritage that made him the ideal candidate to bridge a dangerous divide. His mother was a princess of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but his father was Elitha, a king of the Fomorians. Think about the political genius of this. By making Bres king, they weren't just getting a leader, they were forging a peace treaty. They were uniting the two most powerful races in the world through a shared bloodline on the throne. Bres would be a king for both peoples, a symbol of a new era of cooperation. It was a brilliant move, a strategic masterstroke. It was also the single worst decision they would ever make. From the moment Bres took the throne, a cold, miserly shadow fell over the land. The Tuatha Dé Danann were a people of immense generosity. A king's worth was measured by how much he gave away, by the richness of his feasts, the splendor of his court, the gold on the arms of his followers. Hospitality wasn't just good manners, it was a sacred duty. And Bres failed that duty on every conceivable level. Under his rule, the great halls of the Tuatha Dé fell silent. There were no feasts, no laughter, no songs from the bards. The storytellers said that in Bres's court, the knives of his champions were never greased with lard from fine meats, and the breath of his warriors never smelled of ale, because there was none to be had. He was a king of scarcity in a land of plenty, but it was worse than just being cheap. It was about humiliation. Bres, with Fomorian blood running thick in his veins, seemed to despise the very gods he now ruled. He put them to work, not as warriors or advisors, but as common laborers. Ogma, the great champion, the inventor of the Ogham alphabet, a warrior so mighty his face shone like the sun, was forced to haul firewood to the royal forts like a common servant. And the Dagda, the good god, the lord of great knowledge, father figure to the entire pantheon, was commanded to dig ditches and build fortifications. Day after day the Dagda toiled, his hands raw, his back breaking, all while being mocked and given meager rations by Bres's overseers. This wasn't just a king being a bad boss. This was a fundamental violation of the cosmic order. It was an insult to the very essence of what the Tuatha Dé Danann were. And all the while, Bres was levying crushing taxes on his own people, siphoning the wealth of Ireland away to his Fomorian relatives across the sea. He wasn't a king. He was a parasite. While the spirit of the Tuatha Dé was being ground into the dirt, another, quieter drama was unfolding. Nuada, the deposed king, had not simply faded into obscurity. He was being tended to by the master physician, Dien Sect. Dien Sect was a god of healing, but even his power had its limits. He could not regrow a lost limb, but what he couldn't regrow he could replace. Working with the master artificer, Creighton, the god of metalworking, Dien Sect undertook a project of breathtaking magic and craftsmanship. They began to forge a new arm for Nuada, not a crude prosthetic but a thing of wonder. They fashioned it from pure, gleaming silver, jointed and articulated with such impossible skill that it could move and flex and grip just like a real arm of flesh and blood. For a year and a day they toiled, and when they were finished, they attached it to Nuada's shoulder. The silver fused with his body, and he could move his new hand, clench his new fist. He was whole again. He was now Nuada Ergetlam, Nuada of the silver hand. But even with a new arm the law was tricky. Was a silver arm truly the same as a flesh one? Was he still considered maimed? The debate could have raged for years, but fate was about to force the issue. The breaking point for Bres's tyrannical reign came not from a warrior, but from a poet. A young wandering bard named Cairbre arrived at the king's court. Now in ancient Ireland, a poet was a figure of immense power and prestige. They were the keepers of history, the weavers of praise, and the wielders of satire so potent it was considered a form of magic. When a poet of Cairbre's standing arrived at a king's hall, he was to be treated with the highest honor, given the best seat, the finest food, the strongest drink. But when Cairbre arrived at the court of Bres the Beautiful, he was shown no such honor. He was shoved into a tiny, dark, narrow little room with no fire and no proper bed. And for his meal, he was brought not a roasted pig or a side of beef, but 3 small, dry cakes on a tiny little plate. This was the ultimate insult. It was a rejection of everything the Tuatha Dé Danann held sacred. Cairbre, seething with righteous fury, spent the night composing. And the next morning as he left the court, he turned and unleashed upon Bres the very first satire ever spoken in Ireland. It was a short, sharp, brutal poem, a curse wrapped in verse, mocking the king's stinginess and the poverty of his spirit. And something incredible happened. In this world, a poet's words had physical power. The satire struck Bress like a disease. Hideous, red boils erupted all over his face, disfiguring his famous beauty. His luck soured. His crops failed. His authority evaporated in an instant. The satire didn't just hurt his reputation. It magically and physically blighted him. He was no longer perfect. And a king, as everyone knew, had to be perfect. The spell was broken. The Tuatha Dé Danann saw Bress for what he truly was. A greedy Fomorian sympathizing tyrant hidden behind a handsome face. A great council was called, and the lords and champions of the Tuatha Dé, led by the now restored Nuada of the Silver Hand, confronted him. They laid out his crimes, his lack of generosity, his disrespect, his oppression. Stripped of his beauty and his authority by a poet's curse, Bress had no choice. He abdicated the throne. He was exiled, cast out from the people he had so cruelly ruled. But Bress did not go quietly into the night. He didn't seek a lonely island to live out his days in shame. No, he went home. He crossed the churning sea and ran straight to the shadowy fortresses of the Fomorians, to the court of his father. He went there crying for vengeance, begging for an army to take back what he had lost. Back in Ireland, the throne was empty once more. But this time there was a clear and obvious choice. Nuada Ergitlam, Nuada of the Silver Hand, was whole again. He was their rightful leader, their battle-tested hero. With a roar of approval that shook the hills, he was restored as High King of the Tuatha Dé Danann. There was celebration, feasting, and a feeling that the natural order had finally been set right. But as they raised their cups to their returned king, a dark tide was gathering in the east. The Fomorians were listening to the poisonous words of their exiled son, and they were preparing for a war that would make the first battle for Ireland look like a drunken scuffle. The real fight was just beginning. The journey of Bress back to his father's people was a journey from light into shadow. He left the green and sunlit hills of Ireland and sailed east, toward the cold, gray mists that shrouded the Fomorian Isles. He found his father, Elitha, a king among the Fomorians, but a king whose power was dwarfed by others. Bress stood before the great assembly of Fomorian lords, a council of nightmares. There was Indek, son of the goddess Danu, a king whose form shifted like smoke and water, and whose heart was a cold stone. And there was the one they all feared, the one whose gaze was death itself, Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor sat on a throne of black basalt, his massive frame hunched, his head bowed as if under a great weight. One of his eyes was clamped shut, held by heavy iron clasps, for it was said that if he ever opened it upon a field of battle, entire armies would wither and die like grass in a fire. Bress, his face still smarting with humiliation, told his story. He painted himself as the victim, the rightful king unjustly deposed. He spoke of the insults, the lack of respect, the greed of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He twisted the truth until it was a weapon in his hand, and he asked for one thing: an army to take back what was his. Elitha, his father, was hesitant. He remembered his union with Eriu, the beauty of the land, and the promise of the child they had created. He advised his son to try and win back his kingdom through kindness and fairness, not by force. But the other Fomorian lords, they laughed. A low rumbling sound like stones grinding together in the deep. They saw an opportunity. Bress's personal vendetta was the perfect excuse, the key that would unlock the door to Ireland. For generations they had seen Ireland as their rightful prize, a rich jewel to be plundered. Now, the son of one of their own was inviting them in. Balor of the Evil Eye slowly lifted his head. He did not open his deadly eye, but his other eye, a chip of obsidian, fixed on Bress. He agreed. Indek agreed. They would give Bress his army. They would muster the full, monstrous strength of the Fomorian race. From every dark corner of the world, from under the waves and from desolate islands, they would call their warriors. Beings with the heads of goats and the bodies of men. Giants who could crush chariots with one hand. Sorcerers who commanded the storms. They would not just reclaim a throne for Bress. They would enslave the Tuatha Dé Danann and extinguish their light forever. Back in Ireland, a fragile peace had settled. Nuada, with his new arm of gleaming, articulated silver, sat once more on the throne at Tara. The laughter and music had returned to the great hall, but it was a nervous peace. a piece with one eye on the horizon. The damage of Bress's reign was not so easily undone. The Fomorian tax collectors he had invited in were still there. Two grim figures named Sickle and Oitriolac. They stalked the land, demanding a brutal tribute: 2/3 of all newborn children, 2/3 of all corn, and 2/3 of all milk. It was a tax paid in sorrow and starvation, a constant, bleeding wound that reminded the Tuatha Dé Danann of their folly. They were free of Bress, but the shadow of the Fomorians still lay heavy upon them. They knew Bress had gone to his kin. They knew he would be back. And they knew that when he returned, it would be with a tide of darkness at his back. Nuada held council with the Dagda, with Ogma, with Dien sect. They were warriors, poets, and craftsmen of incredible power. But they were outnumbered. The Fomorians were a force of nature, an ancient, chaotic power that had existed long before them. A deep sense of dread began to permeate the land. It seemed they had traded one tyrant for a coming apocalypse. And then one day, a stranger came to the gates of Terra. He was young, tall, and so impossibly radiant that the guards had to shield their eyes. He carried a silver shield and a bronze spear, and he rode a magnificent horse that seemed to step on the wind itself. He announced to the doorkeeper that he wished to offer his service to King Nuada. The doorkeeper, a stern and officious man, looked him up and down. "And what is your art?" he asked. "For no one without a specific skill or craft may enter the gates of Terra." The young man smiled, a flash of light. "I am a wright," he said, "a master carpenter." The doorkeeper shook his head. "We have no need of you. We already have a master wright, Lugh Luchade." The young man was not deterred. "Then I am a smith." The doorkeeper scoffed. "We have column of the 3 new ways of smithing." "Then I am a champion," the warrior declared. "We have Ogma himself," the doorkeeper replied, gesturing to the fortress. "He is the champion of champions." The young man continued, his voice calm and clear, listing his skills one by one. "I am a harpist. We have Abhian, the master musician. I am a poet and a historian. We have Ugg, the poet of lore. I am a sorcerer. We have many druids and magicians of great power. I am a physician. We have Dien sect and his children. I am a cupbearer. We have 9 of the finest. I am a worker in bronze and gold. We have Credden Sir, the master craftsman." For every skill the stranger named, the doorkeeper had an answer. Terra was the heart of the Tuatha Dé Danann. It wanted for nothing. Finally, the doorkeeper, growing impatient, said, "We have no need of you. Go on your way." The young man leaned in, his eyes shining with an almost divine intelligence. "Then ask your king this one question," he said. "Do you have any one man within these walls who possesses every single one of these skills?" The doorkeeper was stunned into silence. He had no answer. He hurried inside and told King Nuada what had transpired. The king was intrigued. A master of all arts? Seemed impossible. "Let him be tested," Nuada commanded. He sent for his greatest master of Fitchel, the complex and strategic board game of the gods. The master sat across from the stranger, the carved wooden board between them. The stranger played with a speed and brilliance that left the court master breathless. He saw moves within moves, strategies that unfolded like a flower blooming in fast motion. In the end, the stranger won the game so decisively, he even invented a new legendary move in the process, a move that would forever after be known as Luffa's Leap. News of this reached Nuada. This was no mere braggart. "Bring him in," the king said. The young man finally entered the great hall of Terra. As he walked, a hush fell over the assembly. He seemed to carry the light of the sun with him. He introduced himself. "I am Lugh Lamfada," he said. Lugh of the long arm. Nuada gestured for him to sit in the sage's seat, the place of highest honor reserved for the wisest among them. But even as Lugh sat, an ancient, gnarled champion of the court, a man of immense strength, grumbled. He pointed to a massive flagstone outside the hall, a stone so large it took 80 oxen to move it. "If you are as mighty as you are clever," the old champion sneered, "let's see you move that stone and show us where the fortress is weakest." Lugh rose from the sage's seat, walked outside, and without a moment's hesitation, heaved the colossal flagstone onto his shoulders. He carried it not to a weak point in the wall, but to the center of the fortress, and then with a great cry, hurled it back to its original position, fitting it perfectly into the earth. The entire court was speechless. King Nuada rose from his throne. He looked at Lugh, at his shining face, his powerful frame, and the fierce intelligence in his eyes. He saw more than a champion or a smith or a sorcerer. He saw a synthesis of all their greatness in one man. He saw their salvation. Nuada descended the steps of his throne. He walked to Lugh, and in an act that shocked everyone, he gestured for Lugh to take his place. For 13 days, Nuada declared, his voice ringing with authority, you shall be king in my stead. You will lead us. You will devise the strategy to defeat the darkness that comes for us. Lugh, the stranger who had arrived at the gate only hours before, ascended the steps and sat upon the High King's throne. A new age had dawned. The Fomorians were gathering their monstrous hordes, but here in the heart of Terra, a light had just been ignited. A light so brilliant, it just might be enough to hold back the night. The news of Lugh's ascension spread like wildfire across the sea. When word reached Bress, the deposed tyrant, he didn't wait for an invitation to leave. He fled, his tail between his legs, back to the cold, watery kingdoms of the Fomorians. He went first to his father, Elitha, a Fomorian king with a glimmer of nobility, and pleaded for an army to reclaim his throne. But Elitha, seeing the injustice of his son's rule, refused. He told Bress, you have no right to gain by injustice what you could not keep by justice. But Bress would not be deterred. He went deeper, further into the darkness, to the ultimate Fomorian power, Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor, the Titan of Destruction, whose single venomous eye could lay waste to entire armies with a single glance. And Balor listened. He saw an opportunity not just to help Bress, but to finally crush the Tuatha Dé Danann, to extinguish their light and claim the green island of Ireland for his own monstrous kin. The call went out. From every dark corner of the world, the Fomorians gathered. Indek, son of the goddess Danu, brought his legions. Monstrous beings, twisted and powerful, with the heads of goats and horses, and single arms and legs, they swarmed towards Ireland, a tide of nightmares ready to crash upon the shore. Their fleet was so vast it was said to stretch from the Scilly Isles all the way to the coast of Ireland, a bridge of ships blotting out the sun. Back in Terra, Lugh was not idle. He knew the storm was coming, but he was not a king who would wait for the thunder. He was the storm. He immediately began to prepare, not just by sharpening swords, but by marshalling the very magic of his people. He called a great council of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and one by one, he asked the greatest among them a simple, powerful question. What art will you bring to the battle? First stood Goibniu, the master smith. He declared, though the men of Ireland fight for 7 years, I will supply them with every spearhead they cast. No spearhead made by my hand shall ever miss its mark, and no Fomorian it strikes shall ever taste life again. Then came Diensect, the physician god. He promised, any man of the Danann who is wounded, unless his head is struck off or his brain or spinal cord is severed, I will make him whole again, ready to fight the very next day. And his children, Octrielic and Mayak, and his daughter Ermed, pledged to assist him, their combined healing arts a miracle of life against the coming tide of death. Ogma, the champion, the inventor of the Ogham script, rose and swore that he would personally slay the Fomorian king and capture a third of their army. His strength was the rock upon which their battle line would be built. The Dagda, the good god, with his booming voice and immense power, promised more. All the skills you boast of, he rumbled, I will wield them all myself. He would be a sorcerer, a warrior, a protector, a champion, all in one. He was their secret weapon, a force of nature in the form of a god. And so it went. Lugh the right promised to supply all the shields and spear shafts. Craden the metalworker swore to provide the rivets for the spears, the hilts for the swords, and the bosses for the shields. Even the sorcerers and druids came forward, promising to cast enchantments that would weaken the Fomorians, to call down showers of fire upon their heads, and to hide the very rivers and lakes of Ireland from their thirsty mouths. Lugh had not just assembled an army, he had orchestrated a symphony of divine power, with every god and goddess playing their part. While these preparations were underway, the Dagda took on a mission of his own. He traveled to the river Eunice in Connaught for a clandestine meeting. There he found her waiting, the Morrigan, the great queen, the phantom queen, goddess of war, fate, and death. She appeared with one foot on either side of the river, washing the bloody armor of those destined to die. She was a fearsome sight, But the Dagda was not afraid. They spoke of the coming battle, and there, by the water's edge, they came together. Their union was not one of simple passion. It was a sacred magical act, a binding of the earth's power with the fury of war, a divine promise that sovereignty and victory would belong to the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Morrigan gave the Dagda her counsel, revealing the Fomorians' plans and promising to use her own terrible magic to sap the strength of their king. Later, acting as a spy, the Dagda went to the Fomorian camp. They captured him, but instead of killing him, they decided to mock him. Knowing of his legendary appetite, they brewed a monstrous porridge. They emptied 5 great cauldrons of milk, flour, fat, and entire carcasses of pigs and goats into a hole in the ground, a meal fit for a giant. They told him he would be killed if he didn't eat every last bite. The Fomorians laughed, thinking they had humiliated the good god. But they had underestimated his capacity. The Dagda took up a ladle so large it could hold half a dozen people, and he began to eat. He scraped the pit clean, down to the last stone and speck of soil. He had not only consumed their feast, he had consumed their mockery, turning their joke into a display of his own immense power. He walked away from their camp, his belly so swollen he could barely move, leaving the Fomorians stunned and more than a little afraid. Finally, the day arrived. On the plains of Moitura near Sligo, the two armies faced each other. On one side stood the Tuatha Dé Danann, shining and brilliant. Their armor gleamed, their spears were perfectly crafted, and they moved as one, a unified force of beauty and order. On the other side stood the Fomorian horde, a chaotic, grotesque mass of brute force, giants and monsters, shambling creatures of the deep, their forms a mockery of nature, their only unity found in their shared desire for destruction. The air itself grew heavy, thick with anticipation and crackling with raw magic. The battle began not with a simple charge, but with individual challenges. Warriors from both sides stepped forward to prove their prowess in single combat. But soon the full fury was unleashed. The armies crashed together with a sound like the breaking of the world, and the promises made in terror were fulfilled. For every spear the Danann threw, a new one, perfect and deadly, appeared in their hands, forged in an instant by Goibnia's magic. The Fomorians were baffled. How could they face an enemy that never ran out of weapons? But a greater shock was yet to come. As the Danann warriors fell, wounded and broken, their comrades carried them to a special location behind the lines, the Well of Slain. Dien Sect and his children stood over this enchanted spring, chanting spells of renewal. They would place the wounded warriors into the water, and the men would emerge, completely healed, ready to rejoin the fight as if they had never been touched. The Fomorians watched in horror. They were fighting an army that could not be diminished, an army that could not die. Their brute strength was useless against such magic. Desperate, they sought an answer. They sent a spy, a young warrior named Ruadan. He was the son of Bress and the goddess Brigid, a child of 2 worlds, with blood from both Fomorian and Danann veins. He slipped through the chaos and found the source of the Danann's endless arsenal, the magical forge of Goibniu. Seeing the smith god at his work, Ruadan took up a spear and hurled it, striking Goibniu in the side. The great smith roared in pain, but as Ruadan turned to flee, Goibniu ripped the spear from his own body and threw it back with unerring aim, striking the young spy and killing him instantly. The Fomorians now knew one of their enemy's secrets. But the death of Ruadan at Goibniu's hand had severed the last fragile link between the two peoples. Now there was no turning back. And as they mourned their fallen spy, the Fomorians learned of the other, greater magic at play. They learned of the well that brought the dead back to life. Baylor of the evil, I knew with chilling certainty that as long as that well existed, they could never win. He gave a new command, one that superseded all others: destroy the well at any cost. A wave of Fomorian shock troops, their faces painted with mud and blood, broke from the main battle line. They ignored the duels of champions, the clashes of shields, and the screams of the dying. They had a new god, a new purpose, given to them by the voice of Baylor himself. They ran a river of death and iron straight for the Well of Slain. It was a spear thrust at the Danann's very soul. Guarding the well were not warriors but healers. Dien Sect, the master physician, stood with his children, Mayak and Octriolac. For hours their life had been a frantic rhythm of pain and renewal. They would drag broken bodies from the fray, immerse them in the enchanted waters, and watch, with a mixture of divine pride and exhaustion, as men with shattered limbs and gaping wounds rose again, whole and ready to fight. They were the secret heart of the Danann war machine, the engine that made their army seemingly infinite. Now that engine was under direct assault. The Fomorian wave crashed against the small cordon of guards protecting the healers. Shields splintered. Spears snapped. The Danann warriors fought with the desperation of men protecting their last hope, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The insect, who had spent a lifetime mending, now drew a short, sharp blade. His children did the same. Their movements were precise, anatomical, not the wild slashes of a berserker, but the calculated cuts of a surgeon, disabling tendons, piercing arteries. They fought to preserve life, but now they were forced to take it, and the irony was as bitter as poison on the tongue. But for every Fomorian they cut down, 3 more took his place. They clambered over the bodies of their own dead, their eyes fixed on the shimmering, placid water of the well. Leading the final, overwhelming charge was in deck, a Fomorian king whose head was said to be that of a goat, and whose fury was legendary. He swept aside the last of the Danann guards as a storm sweeps away autumn leaves. He and his personal guard now stood on the precipice of the well, the last line of defense broken. The insect and his children stood before them, bloodied but defiant, the last flickering candles against a hurricane. Indek didn't even bother to fight them. He simply bellowed a command, and his warriors swarmed past the healers. They had not brought swords to this fight. They had brought stones. Each Fomorian warrior carried a large, jagged rock, torn from the battlefield itself. They formed a chain, a living conveyor belt of destruction, passing stones from the edge of the fray to the lip of the well. The first stone landed with a sickening splash, shattering the perfect, magical surface of the water. Another followed, and another. It was not a chaotic frenzy. It was a methodical, rhythmic execution, a drumbeat of doom. 1 stone, for a brother slain by a reborn Danann warrior. A second, for a father's life cut short. A third, for the generations of exile and hatred. Each rock that plunged into the depths was an anchor, pulling the Danann's hope down with it. The insect could only watch in horror, his physician's mind screaming at the violation. This was not just the destruction of a tactical advantage. It was the murder of magic itself, the desecration of a sacred place of healing and life. The water, once clear and shimmering with power, turned cloudy with mud and grime. The level of the well began to rise, not with water, but with a cairn of rough, gray stone. The chanting of the healers, the secret words that activated the well's magic, were drowned out by the grunts of the Fomorians and the percussive thud of rock against rock. Finally, with the last heavy stone, it was done. Where a pool of life had once shimmered, there was now only a crude mound of rubble, a makeshift grave for a miracle. The Fomorians gave a guttural roar of triumph, a sound that cut through the din of the wider battle. And then a strange quiet fell over that part of the field. A Danann warrior, his arm hanging by a thread of sinew, stumbled towards the well, his eyes wide with pain and hope. He saw the healers, their shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw the mound of stones, and the hope in his eyes died, replaced by a dull, terrifying understanding. He fell to his knees, not from his wound, but from the weight of despair. The change was immediate. It was a shift in the very air, a vibration that every member of the Tuatha Dé Danann felt deep in their bones. Miles away, at the center of the battle, Lugh was a whirlwind of light. His spear, the invincible Giasail, sang through the air, never missing its mark. His slingstone whirled, felling Fomorian champions from 100 paces. He moved with a grace that was not of the mortal world, a blur of bronze and gold, turning the tide wherever he went. He had just shattered the shield line of Bress, the former king, sending the disgraced tyrant reeling back into the Fomorian ranks. A cheer went up from the Danann warriors around him. It was a moment of victory, a surge of adrenaline and triumph. But Lugh felt it. A sudden cold, a dimming of the world's light, a subtle muting of its color. It was as if a string on the great harp of the world had just snapped. He looked over his shoulder in the direction of the well, and a cold dread gripped his heart. He knew with a certainty that transcended sight and sound that something precious had just been lost forever. Their safety net was gone. From this moment on, every wound was real. Every death was final. On a hill overlooking the chaos, King Nuada felt it too. He watched as one of his warriors, a man he had seen fall and rise again just an hour before, was cut down. This time the warrior did not move. He did not stir. His light simply went out. Tuatha looked down at his own silver hand, the cold, lifeless replacement for the flesh and blood he had lost. It had always been a symbol of his imperfection, his one wound that even the well of slain could not heal. Now it was a symbol of his entire people. They were all vulnerable now. They were all breakable. And from the highest vantage point, within his fortress of shadow, Veiler of the evil, I felt the shift most keenly of all. A slow, terrible smile spread across his lips. The Danann's greatest trick, their most infuriating magic, was undone. They were now finite, mortal. He watched the battle rage, but he no longer saw an endless tide of golden warriors. He saw a dwindling resource, an army that could be bled, an army that could be broken. The board was reset. The Danann's queen was taken. Now all that was left was the endgame. Veiler rose from his throne, the leather covering his great, terrible eye seeming to pulse with the dark energy. It was time to unleash the weapon that could end it all. He descended from his perch and began to move towards the battlefield, a slow, inexorable eclipse, ready to blot out the sun. The air itself seemed to curdle as Veiler strode onto the field. He was a mountain in motion, a walking fortress of muscle and malice, and where his shadow fell, the very grass seemed to wither and turn black. The renewed hope of the Tuatha Dé Danann, so recently kindled by Lugh's brilliance, now guttered and died in the face of this ultimate horror. This was not a king or a champion. This was an ending, an apocalypse given form. Warriors who had faced down legions of Fomorians without flinching now found their limbs locked with a primal terror. Their swords felt like twigs in their hands, their shields like paper. All sound seemed to drain from the world, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of Veiler's footsteps, each one a hammer blow against the heart of Ireland. He stopped in the center of the carnage, a still point in the swirling chaos. He cared nothing for the duels and skirmishes raging around him. He was here for one purpose. 4 of his hulking attendants surrounded him, their faces grim masks of concentration. They carried heavy bronze hooks, and with a great synchronized effort, they latched them onto the drooping leathery flesh of his monstrous eyelid. Slowly, groaning under the immense strain, they began to heave. The eyelid, thick and wrinkled and veined with purple, began to lift. It was like watching the opening of a tomb, the revealing of some blasphemous secret that should have remained buried for all time. A sliver of crimson light appeared, a light that did not illuminate but rather consumed. A low humming sound began to fill the air, a vibration that resonated deep in the bones, promising utter annihilation. King Tuatha, his silver hand gleaming, saw the danger. He rallied his personal guard, shouting for his warriors to charge, to stop the Fomorians before that terrible eye could open fully. He was a king to the last, leading from the front, his courage a beacon against the encroaching darkness. He and his finest warriors surged forward, a wave of silver and gold against the Fomorian tide. But they were too late. The lid was halfway open now. The sliver of red had widened into a burning crescent. The humming intensified into a malevolent drone. Veiler's gaze, a sliver of pure destruction, swept across the charging Tuatha Dé Danann. It wasn't a beam or a blast of fire. It was more insidious. Where his gaze fell, reality itself seemed to unravel. King Tuatha, his sword raised high for a final defiant strike, was simply gone. One moment he was the magnificent king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a figure of radiant light and power. The next, there was only a wisp of smoke and a pile of blackened, molten silver where his arm had been. His guards, the bravest in his army, vanished alongside him, erased from existence without a sound. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the Tuatha Dé Danann ranks. Their king was dead. Their charge was broken. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over them. The Fomorians roared in triumph, sensing victory was now just a heartbeat away. The attendants gave another mighty heave, and the eyelid rose higher still. The full, terrible orb was about to be revealed. But then a single voice cut through the despair. "Grandfather!" The cry was clear, sharp, and utterly without fear. Lugh stepped forward from the ranks alone. He held no great shield, no heavy armor. He was a slender, youthful figure of light standing against a mountain of darkness. In his hand he held a simple sling. Veiler turned his massive head, the movement slow and ponderous, the half-open eye fixed on the young warrior. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound like grinding stones. This was the child of the prophecy, the little spark of defiance he had tried to extinguish at birth. "So," Balor's voice boomed, a sound that cracked the very ground, "the whelp has come to die." The attendants gave one final, groaning pull. The eyelid was almost fully open. The red orb within began to pulse, gathering its power for the killing blow. The air grew supernaturally hot, and the ground around Lugh began to smoke. He had seconds, perhaps less. But Lugh was not just a warrior. He was Lugh of the long arm, master of all arts. And he knew this was not a battle of strength but of timing. As the last fold of leathery flesh cleared the monstrous, pulsing eye, as the full world-ending power of Balor's gaze began to cohere, Lugh moved. His motion was a blur, a single perfect act of grace and speed. He whirled the sling around his head once, the air screaming as the stone accelerated. He was not aiming for Balor's head or his chest. He was aiming for the weapon itself. He released the stone. The small, smooth river stone, known as a tathlum, flew with impossible speed and accuracy. It became a streak of light, a tiny comet on a collision course with the dying star. It flew directly towards the center of the baleful red eye. It struck home. There was no grand explosion. There was a sickening, wet, crunching sound. The stone did not bounce off. It punched through the cornea, through the lens, and kept going, propelled by all the divine power of Lugh. It drove the entire corrupted eyeball backwards, out through the back of Balor's skull in a horrific spray of black ichor and shattered bone. Balor stood frozen for a single silent moment. And then the power of his eye, now facing the wrong way, unleashed itself. A colossal sweeping beam of pure destructive energy erupted from the back of his head. It wasn't aimed. It was a dying spasm of infinite power. It tore directly through the ranks of the Fomorian commanders who stood behind him, vaporizing 27 of them in a single horrific instant. The Fomorian kings, the champions, the inner circle. All of them were annihilated by their own ultimate weapon. Balor swayed, his one weapon now a gaping, smoking hole in his head. He took one step, then another, before crashing to the ground with a force that shook the entire plain of Moytura. The mountain had fallen. The apocalypse was over. For a moment there was absolute silence. And then the Tuatha Dé Danann erupted. A single unified roar of triumph and fury shook the heavens. Seeing their god-king fall, his power turned against them. The Fomorian army completely broke. Their iron discipline, built on fear, shattered into a million pieces. They dropped their weapons and they ran, a panicked, disorganized mob. The rout was absolute. The Tuatha Dé Danann, their hearts filled with a righteous fire, surged forward. This was no longer a battle, it was a cleansing. They chased the Fomorians to the sea, ensuring the tyrants would never again set foot on Irish soil. When the red tide of war finally receded, Lugh stood as the undisputed master of the field. The Fomorian threat was not just defeated, it was extinguished. Ireland belonged to the Tuatha Dé Danann. As his warriors began to celebrate, to tend to their wounded and honor their dead, the captured Fomorian leader, Bress, was dragged before him in chains. Bress, the beautiful but flawed king who had started this all, knelt before Lugh, expecting a swift death. "Spare me," he pleaded, "and I will give you a gift that will outlast any victory in battle." Lugh, his face still hard from the fight, looked down at him. "What could you possibly offer me, Oathbreaker?" "I will ensure that Ireland's cows are always full of milk," Bress offered. But Lugh, conferring with his druids, knew this was a promise already within their power. He refused. "Then," Bress said, his voice desperate, "I will give you the true secret of this land, a secret the Fomorians have hoarded. I will teach your people the rhythm of the soil. I will teach them when to plow, when to sow, and when to reap. I will give you an endless harvest, a victory not for a day, but for every season, for all time." Lugh looked at the blood-soaked ground. He looked at the faces of his weary, triumphant people. He had won the war with a stone. Now he could secure the peace with a seed. In an act of profound wisdom that would define his reign, he lowered his spear. He chose knowledge over vengeance, life over death. The Great War was over. The age of tyranny was at an end. Now, under the rule of Lugh of the Long Arm, a new age was about to begin. An age of prosperity, of art, and of magic, built not just on the strength of their warriors, but on the wisdom of their king. This new Ireland, shaped by Lugh's brilliance, was a paradise. The four great treasures were not just weapons of war, but tools of creation. The sword of Tuatha ensured justice, the spear of Lugh guaranteed victory in any worthy endeavor, the cauldron of the Dagda provided endless bounty, and the stone of Fal roared in approval of the rightful order. For 30 years the seasons were perfect. The harvests were plentiful, the rivers teemed with fish, and the arts flourished as never before. Music, poetry, and craftsmanship reached heights that would be remembered in song and story for 1,000 years. It was a golden age, a fleeting, perfect moment when gods walked the green hills as kings, and the land itself sang with their magic. But no age lasts forever. A prophecy, old even then, spoke of a final wave of invaders who would come to claim the island. Not misshapen giants from the sea, but men, mortals. From a land far to the south, the sons of Mil, the Milesians, looked towards the horizon. Their own druids had seen a vision of a green island in the west, a jewel of the ocean promised to them by fate. They were a proud, warlike people, the ancestors of the Gaels, and they believed this island, this Innis Fail, was their destiny. After a long journey across the sea, their ships appeared off the coast. The Tuatha Dé Danann, sensing their arrival, were not idle. 3 of their most powerful sorcerers conjured a mighty defense. They shrouded the island in an impenetrable fog, a magical cloak that made it seem as if no land was there at all. They raised a furious storm, a tempest designed to shatter the Milesian fleet and send them to the bottom of the sea. But the Milesians had magic of their own. Their chief poet and judge, a man named Morrigan of the White Knee, stood at the prow of his ship. He sang a powerful incantation to the land itself, an invocation that calmed the winds and parted the mists, appealing not to the gods who ruled it, but to the very spirit of the soil, the rock, and the water. The spell of the Tuatha Dé was broken. The Milesians landed. Instead of immediate war, there was a meeting. The invaders marched inland until they reached the sacred hill of Tara, the seat of the High Kings. There, they were met by the 3 queens of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the sisters Ariu, Bamba, and Fadla. Each queen in turn greeted the Milesians. Each one asked that the newcomers name the island after her, should they conquer it. Morrigan, recognizing the power and sovereignty in their request, agreed. And it was the name of the first queen they met, Ariu, that would endure, giving the island its eternal name, Ireland. But this courtesy was also a challenge. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not ready to simply surrender their home. They proposed a pact. The Milesians were to return to their ships, sail back out beyond the 9th wave, a mystical boundary in Irish lore, and then attempt to land again. If they could make it to shore a second time, the island would be theirs. The Milesians, confident in their strength and their destiny, agreed. It was a fatal mistake, for they had underestimated the deep magic of their opponents. As soon as their ships crossed the 9th wave, the Tuatha Dé Danann unleashed their full power. A hurricane of magical energy slammed into the fleet. The sky turned black, the sea boiled, and wind screamed with the voices of vengeful spirits. Ships were torn apart. Men were swept into the raging abyss. It was a slaughter. But once again Morrigan stood firm. He sang to the wind, he sang to the sea, and he invoked the land of Ireland once more, and slowly, miraculously, the storm abated. Though their fleet was battered and their numbers reduced, a remnant of the Milesians, hardened and furious, fought their way back to the shore. They had passed the test. The island was theirs by right of the agreement. The war that followed was fierce, but its outcome was now inevitable. The age of the Tuatha Dé Danann as rulers of the physical world was over. The 3 queens, Ariu, Bamba, and Fadla, were slain in battle. The great kings fell. The age of man had come. Yet this was not an ending. It was a transformation. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not mortals to be simply wiped out. They were beings of magic and light, and they could not be destroyed, only displaced. A final council was held between the surviving leaders of the Tuatha Dé and Morrigan, the wise poet judge of the Milesians. It was Morrigan who delivered the final world-altering judgment. Pact was made. Ireland would be divided. The sons of Mil and their descendants would have the world they could see. The soil, the trees, the rivers, the world above ground. The Tuatha Dé Danann in turn would take the world below, the Otherworld. And so a great fating began. Led by the Dagda and the other surviving lords, the divine people of the goddess Danu walked away from the fields and forts of men. They didn't die. They didn't flee across the sea. They simply went inwards. They passed into the ancient burial mounds, the stone cairns and earthen barrows that dotted the landscape. These mounds, known as the Sidhi, became the gateways to their new realm. From that day forward, they were no longer known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. They became the Sidhi, the people of the mounds. Their world was no longer the physical soil of Ireland, but its spiritual reflection. A timeless, magical kingdom hidden just behind the veil of mortal perception. A place where time flowed differently, where beauty never faded, and where magic was the very air they breathed. The Dagda became a king of this hidden realm. Lugh of the Long Arm, his brilliance undimmed, became a ghostly champion. Manannán mac Lir retreated fully to his kingdom beneath the waves. But they never truly left. Their presence lingered, seeping into the folklore of the new race of men. They became the source of a million tales told around the hearth on a winter's night. They were the good neighbors, the fair folk, the powerful, capricious beings you did not want to offend. A sudden stroke of good luck? A gift from the Sidhi? A cow that suddenly went dry? A child that fell ill? You must have angered them. Over centuries, their legends warped and changed. The magnificent, godlike figures were diminished in the popular imagination. The shining Lugh, master of all arts, was eventually worn down by time and tale into the archetype of the leprechaun, a diminutive trickster guarding a pot of gold. The terrifying Morrigan, the phantom queen of battle, became the wailing banshee, a specter who foretold a family's death. They became the fairies, sometimes beautiful and helpful, other times terrifying and dangerous. They were the force that snatched people away into their timeless realm. The whispers on the wind in a lonely glen, the feeling of being watched in an ancient forest. They became the magic of Ireland itself. The story of the Tuatha Dé Danann is not a story of defeat, but of a masterful retreat. It's the story of how a pantheon of gods, faced with the unstoppable tide of humanity, chose not to be forgotten, but to be woven into the very fabric of the land they loved. They surrendered the crown but kept the kingdom. They gave up the world of sunlight and soil for a world of twilight and spirit, ensuring they would never truly vanish. They are still there, in the mist that clings to a Kerry mountain, in the strange silence of a Neolithic tomb at Newgrange, in the sudden, unexplainable inspiration of a poet or a musician. They are the hidden magic living just beside us, a reminder that the world is older, stranger, and far more wondrous than our mortal eyes can see. They are the gods who became fairies, the kings who became whispers, the ancient, shining ones who haunt the beautiful, sorrowful, and enchanted soul of Ireland forever.